woken up. She heard someone say mice and killing.
Hi, Molly.
Hi, are you going to say anything? She's making little brrr noises, but I don't think the mic can pick them up. Yeah, that's a shame. Well, I can make her make a noise. It's just that would be by picking her up and annoying her.
Do not be cruel to podcasting cat.
Yeah? You're going to go back to sleep, podcast cat? Okay. She's asleep. So, welcome to Analysis Roulette.
Welcome to Analysis Roulette. We've had a little hiatus in recording, so we might be a little bit loose.
We're a little rusty, a little dusty.
Yeah. We needed a break, so we had a break. We had so many episodes pre-recorded that you will not notice anything, listener, except that we've told you, which spoils the magic. I am Duck. My friends are he, they.
I'm Dear. I use they, them pronouns. And you might notice a slight change in our ability to podcast, but you shouldn't have noticed a change in our schedule for podcasting, which is what really matters.
Exactly. This for you should just be a fun diversion into the land of, whoa, these people forgot what they're doing.
Yeah, so context, it has been 2 or 3 months since we recorded an episode.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have not had internet for 2 or 3 months.
Great.
Actually, I haven't had internet for more than 3 months now, but there have been brief intervals of internet where I could do podcasting and my job.
Yeah, we've been struggling, listener. We've been struggling.
I will not name names, but a specific Wi-Fi provider and a specific call centre operative at a specific Wi-Fi provider can be blamed for many of our troubles.
And we deserve medals, or rather Dia deserves medals, for not doing a murder.
I haven't killed anyone. I wish I had sometimes.
Sometimes not killing anyone is the best that the world can expect of you.
Exactly, yes. And then we were delayed an extra day because yesterday I had had a very long train ride and was quite hungover and forgot that we were supposed to be doing this.
Fortunately, it's a bank holiday.
Yes.
I had no plans except for if the weather is nice, I will go and sit in the park and read my book. And listener, the weather is not nice.
No, I'm further south than you and it's very grey.
It's raining so much.
You are bereft. You are adrift. But yes, no.
Here we are.
The upshot of this is that I reread Lord of the Rings in February.
Right.
It is not February.
It is no longer February. I also reread Lord of the Rings for the first time since I was about 10. It's better than I remembered, which I'm going to blame primarily on me being 10 last time I read this thing.
I read Lord of the Rings on paper. I listened to it on audiobook as a kid, and I usually go for audiobooks when I'm reconsuming things for the podcast, just because I've got a limited amount of time in my life that I can't spend washing up or doing laundry.
Right.
And I definitely think there were a few bits I maybe slept through as a child, because there was some sections that were just like fully unfamiliar to me.
There were some sections I definitely didn't remember, but again, it's been a long time. And I should say this is the first time I've read it in paper as a book since I was about 10. But the last time I listened to the BBC 13-episode radio play adaptation was a couple of years ago. Because that is, for me, the canonical version of it.
It's so good. The BBC used to do such good fantasy audio dramas.
Oh,
They've really dropped the ball.
Honestly, it's Brian Sibley, who was some kind of adaptation genius. He did Lord of the Rings, he did the BBC Narnia adaptations, probably a bunch of other stuff that I didn't listen to on repeat as a child, but if I hear that name, I'm like, oh, he's good at this.
Okay, so Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. To avoid me doing all of the talking, do you want to explain Lord of the Rings?
Oh, goodness. Yes, sure. Why not? Okay.
Don't feel the need to explain all the plot. It's not going to be relevant to my analysis.
Lord of the Rings is a very obscure little fantasy novel you might not have heard of.
No one's heard of
it. I'm struggling to take myself seriously. Okay, so the meta-narrative I'm going to go with is maybe the easiest thing to start with, which is J.R.R. Tolkien was an English scholar specialising in, generally speaking, the literature and languages of the medieval period in Northern Europe. Woo! My house. He's in my zone. He is very much worshipped by my academic community.
As the one person from the academic community that anyone's ever heard of.
Excuse me, there are 2.
I apologise. Who's the other?
C.S. Lewis.
Who was in the same writing group.
And they were buddies, yes. But yes, J.R.R. Tolkien, at a point in the mid to late 1930s, started looking at writing fantasy fiction as part of partly as, a thing he enjoyed doing. He used to tell stories to his son at bedtime, that kind of thing. But also partly as an ongoing part of the lengthy English tradition of trying to find a true national epic for the British.
Right. We have always been a little insecure about not having our own baseline mythology.
This is particularly true of medievalists, because in medieval literature there was a consensus that there were three great works, which were the Matter of France, the Matter of Rome, and the Matter of Britain. And the Matter of France is about sort of chivalry and nationhood and what it means to be a good person. The Matter of Rome is about politics and empire and what it means to govern well. And the Matter of Britain is fairy stories. It's not really supposed to be about anything, it's just nice. It's courtly and romantic and lovely.
Soft little stories that just sort of happen.
And most of them were written by either the Welsh or the French, which doesn't help.
Which I can see us being insecure about. There's no moral to these stories, they just sort of are.
And people don't really feel like they have as much of a claim on Beowulf as they should, because none of it's set here. And not everybody likes, Paradise Lost.
Yeah, and you end up with a point where sort of you harken back to the greats of English literature, and it's Shakespeare, who is fine, but also modern.
Modern, and also not a grand narrative. It's lots of different.
Right, what are you going to do? Base your nation building self mythology on Chaucer?
Yeah, like we don't have Ovid, Snorri Sturluson. We don't have.
We've got Arthur, but we had to nick him back off the French.
Yeah, and they'd already nicked him off the Welsh, and we weren't getting along with them. Great.
Right.
We don't really love the Arthur story because we can only tell it if we ignore the bits about how Arthur's great work was getting rid of us.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because we're also like, this is the model of English kingship.
I used to be a tour guide in Edinburgh, and one of the things I point out with Arthur's Seat, which is the extinct volcano in Edinburgh, where it is prophesied that in Britain's time of greatest need, King Arthur will return. And I used to say in my tour that what we usually leave out when we tell that myth is that he will return to reclaim Britain for the Welsh by eradicating the English. And without fail, that got at least one cheer from a Scottish person.
Scottish Welsh solidarity is real.
I did occasionally get Welsh people, and I did enjoy just like going, "Oh hey, please be nice to us when you're in charge. What up?"
So, yeah. Lord of the Rings.
So that started with The Hobbit in 1937.
Mm-hmm.
And after the publication of The Hobbit, which is very much a children's story in the vein of 1930s sort of fantasy children's stories, it was seen as a genre for the younglings. He followed that up with a much more adult-oriented trilogy of fantasy stories called The Lord of the Rings.
This is comprised of The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers.
The plot of The Lord of the Rings without leaving out something that we'll get letters about.
I think we just have to embrace that we are going to leave out something that will get us letters, but they'll be nice letters from fantasy fans who want to explain things to us, so we should just accept this.
Yes. So The Lord of the Rings, as I said, it's a trilogy. First The Fellowship of the Ring, then The Two Towers, then The Return of the King.
Mm-hmm.
Circling around essentially the attempt to destroy the One Ring, which was created by the Dark Lord Sauron in order to conquer. Words are so hard. I've forgotten how to podcast. In order to conquer Middle-earth, which is the setting of the entire world in this universe. This is done through our main hero, Frodo, who is a hobbit, the accompanying hobbits, Samwise, Merry, and Pippin, and the wizard, Gandalf, and then the rest of their party, which are Aragorn, Boromir, Legolas, and Gimli, with various add-ons and removals at different stages in the story, until towards the end they reunite with the prior ring holder and weird little creature, Gollum, which is sort of what gives them the final impetus to destroy the ring, which allows them to defeat the armies which are waging war against the people of Middle-earth. Yes. I feel like that's the most broad summary I can give.
Broadly, that is what happens. Along the way of this, the reason it's called The Return of the King is that Aragorn has his own little plot going on where he's the sort of the lost heir to the great ancient kingdoms.
I've
and
skipped
parts of
literally not even the subplots. I've skipped the
yeah.
plots of each
We've
individual novel.
and we're not going to go into, but there is this whole thread that's going to be relevant of restoring the ancient monarchy.
Yeah.
And actually, the whole plot is this interesting combination of restoring the good old days and accepting that the good old days will never come again, but at least we can defeat the evil that defeated the good old days.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very much also.
Not
It's very much also, as we talked about in our Dragon Riders of Pern episode. It's one of those books that does suffer from having been a massive game changer that rewrote the nature of literary canon.
Yes, every plot, every theme that in Lord of the Rings has been redone multiple times.
Often better.
Often better, because oftentimes if you pull out one quiet thread from the Lord of the Rings and like make it the focus, you can do it better. Or you're just writing as a person who's spoken to women.
Yeah,
in your life. We have to.
It was fair for its day, but that is saying so little when its day was 1937.
Its day was 1937, and J.R.R. Tolkien was very much raised in that public school and Oxford life progression, where he literally never spoke to women.
You didn't have to, except
girls
maybe
were not there,
to.
women were not there. They were a foreign species who he never encountered. This is partly why there's none in the book, is he just didn't live in a world where women were.
Yeah, like by the time he wrote the books, he had married one, but that was surprisingly easy to do without speaking to women in the 1930s.
Right, it didn't mean he'd spoken to any other women.
No, it didn't even mean he'd really spoken to her much. I'm
No,
sure he had, but it wasn't necessary. He could have avoided
I'm told
it.
they were very much in love, and they got heroic. They got the poetic model of eternal love on their tombstones, which is very cute.
Yeah, and he also did write his wife into his books in a similar way that he wrote his friends in, which is very sweet.
That is very sweet. He seems to have been, reasonably nice.
But yeah, fair for its day is an extremely low bar.
Yeah. And of course, what has happened since is that The Lord of the Rings has become itself the poetic model of what it is to be fantasy fiction in English.
Exactly, yeah.
Everyone has read it, everyone has imitated it.
Even if you haven't read it, you have it just imprinted on your brain as what fantasy novels look like. It's the fantasy novel people are thinking of when they tell you that, say, A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones is fantasy for people who don't like fantasy. They mean fantasy for people who don't like Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Or occasionally fantasy for people who don't like Harry Potter, but usually Lord of the Rings.
And there are some things to dislike.
Oh, yeah.
Which brings us on to the mode of analysis that we rolled for this, which is the funniest possible mode of analysis to roll for an acknowledged great of the literature, which is a redemptive reading. Now, I did look up, it's not really a scholarly term.
No.
It's one we both know. I think, this is my theory, I think that I am familiar with it because I think it was fairly in vogue among a certain subset of blogs around 2010 that I was reading.
Plausible.
I don't think there's anything more complex to it than that. I think that's the term that we were using amongst ourselves at the time. But the concept here is to take the complaints that are made about a work, the accusations that are leveled at it, and to say, are these things true? Is there a way to understand them which makes them positive, or at least not negative? Can we defend this work against these complaints? Can we find the ways in which this underappreciated work is secretly good? This is the funniest possible project for the Lord of the Rings.
It's the cinema wins kind of approach is kind of where I think was seeing it most when I was coming up. It's the idea that every single story, it's kind of the stance I took on like Lightlark. Every single story is somebody's favourite, and there's a reason for that, even if it's not for you.
Right, there's something good about everything.
So we're taking the extremely bold stance that Lord of the Rings is good, actually.
Right, we are claiming that it is, despite its many detractors, secretly good. It does not deserve its poor reputation. This is a sensible thing to say about the Lord of the Rings.
This is a ridiculous project.
Okay, so I have looked
yesterday. Not yesterday, actually, 2 days ago. Get like quite a lecture from somebody who had not liked our Elder Scrolls episode.
I'm so sorry.
I don't think that she's going to like this.
Please do write to us. We love engagement.
Listener, I am sorry.
So, I have looked up complaints people have about The Lord of the Rings, and I
Did you
propose to
find some?
address them. I found a number. I had to be, in the end, a little bit selective. I have a list of 8, which I propose to address. Bear with me because my notes document has decided that it needs my entire, email details in it. There we are. Okay, so I will list these complaints, and then I will go back and address them. Things that are wrong with The Lord of the Rings. 1. It's too long. 2. It's too slow. 3. People randomly burst into song. 4. It's monarchist. 5. The orcs are always evil. 6. There aren't any women in it. 7. The eagles should have solved the problem on day 1. And 8. It's derivative. So a range of complaints.
Yeah, I feel like there's a spectrum of immediate plausibility to me.
Yeah. So taking it from the top, this is not going to. This will have. There's a thesis at the end, but I am really going to take these various complaints and address them separately. So from the top, it's too long. Not really. I mean, it is quite long. It is quite long, but it is not outstandingly long compared to current standards for fantasy books. And it is long because there is a lot happening.
It's too long if you consider it morally obligatory to read every single appendix and side story and Christopher Tolkien publication. But that's not
if you
actually
feel that
mandatory.
you need to read, if you feel like you have to read everything published in the Lord of the Rings world in order to read the Lord of the Rings, then yes, that's too much material, and some of it is very slow, and the Silmarillion should not be read, it should be listened to, and if you try to read it, you will give yourself a headache.
For reading those things, go for it, but, nobody has a gun to your head.
Right, and you don't have to. You don't have to start at the beginning chronologically with the Silmarillion and work your way forward. You can just read The Lord of the Rings, a trilogy of fantasy books that was published as a standalone trilogy. And if you compare the length of those books to currently published books by beardy white men, because I've noticed that beardy white men get to write longer books than women, but if you compare it to those, it's just a standard fantasy doorstop novel. It's not unusually long.
Yeah, and I think also, I could be wrong about this, but to my mind, the natural reading of the Lord of the Rings verse is you read The Hobbit when you're quite young and enjoy it, and then as you age, you maybe read the Lord of the Rings one after another, and then if you really enjoy them, you maybe read the Silmarillion, and if you really enjoy
if
the
you get
Silmarillion,
so into it that you become like a Lord of the Rings fanatic, then you go and read the
yeah,
other
until
works.
you're reading Christopher Tolkien's letters and the Finnsburg fragment and stuff. And
Right, but at that point,
the
you're not just
fundamental fact
reading
of
the Lord
that
of the
is
Rings.
that each of those steps is an if.
Right, you might never read the Lord of the Rings. You might never go on to the Silmarillion. You might do what I did and bounce off the Silmarillion because it even more than the Lord of the Rings has a very particular prose style. However, I have found that listening to an audiobook of the Silmarillion is great. It was written to be read aloud.
Yeah, I personally have not read the Silmarillion. I have read quite a lot of the other extended Tolkien verse writings because the Silmarillion just did not do it for me.
I did actually finish the Silmarillion because I was at an age and a time when I finished every book I picked up, but I don't remember most of it because they didn't stick. The clearest thing I can say about my experience of the Silmarillion is that I never reread it. Which, if I even vaguely like a book, I reread it at least once. There are books I reread every year. I never reread the Silmarillion. It's the equivalent of do not finish for someone who always finishes books.
Yeah.
But I do think in terms of the internal length of Lord of the Rings, compared to modern fantasy books, it's basically normal, but also there is a lot happening. There is a lot of plot. A more self-indulgent book could make the Helm's Deep sequence into an entire novel by itself.
It feels longer than modern novels, but that's just because it's in a dialect that's died out a bit. That's not really something that anything can be done about. No.
Right, you're not reading modern literature when you read The Lord of the Rings. This stuff is 70 plus years old.
Yeah, it's it's gonna feel a little bit harder to read than something that was published in 2017 because of the linear passage of time, which I don't think J.R.R. Tolkien could really have accounted for.
I don't think we can blame him for that.
This isn't a Clockwork Orange. It shouldn't be a Clockwork Orange, you know?
Right. And I do think there's an extent to which this could have been a 10-book sequence.
Yeah.
Helm's Deep could have been a whole novel, and in The Two Towers it takes up about a sixth of the book. There are things that are of great sort of resonance and depth that take up a paragraph or two because we've got to move on to the next plot point.
And
Which
then
brings us. Sorry, go ahead.
there are bits that are extremely lengthy descriptions, which you probably wouldn't fly in a modern novel because that style has gone out of fashion.
Mhm.
But that's not like an accident of writing.
Right. Well, that brings us to point 2. It's too slow.
Okay.
There is an extent to which this is fair. That extent is the first book. The Fellowship of the Ring is at fault here because those opening sections of gearing up to leave the Shire and getting lost, taking shortcuts through the woods multiple times, and getting rescued by Tom Bombadil twice. Those sections are too slow, which is because Tolkien did not really have a plan. He didn't actually have a plot in mind, and he didn't edit out most of his early sort of noodling around sequences where he was just putting these hobbits in situations. Once the book gets moving with the arrival of Strider, things start happening and they do not stop. There is so much happening all the time.
Fellowship of the Ring is my favourite, and I love all of those sections, but I do also understand why some people don't.
I think it could have done with editing out some of the repetition and compressing some of the time taken to tell it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think it's bad that it's there. I think it could have done with some stronger editing, because I think there is too much of it, and I think it is true that you have to get like halfway through that book before the book starts, because up until then we are on lowest possible stakes, getting lost in the woods. But they're like the local woods. Like twice, the hobbits learn the lesson of if you try to cut across country without knowing where you're going, you get lost. Twice they have to get rescued by Tom Bombadil. Maybe once would have been enough. Maybe we could have moved this along a bit. But that is an editing problem. That is what happens when you didn't actually know what the story was going to be when you started telling it, which we've all been there.
Yeah.
We have all done this.
I also think that it's very plausible to me that J.R.R. Tolkien's editor didn't know what he was doing because adult fantasy novels didn't really exist, and also he was editing the work of like an Oxford professor.
Right. I think it probably was quite difficult to make that call of going through the Fellowship of the Ring with the red pen and going, okay, lose this whole chapter. Which I think I would want to happen to make the book coherent with itself. Because as I say, once it starts happening, things do not stop and there is so much happening all the time.
Mm.
So it stops being slow, is what I can say to this one. It's not slow. It starts slow. There's an interlude. If you're finding The Lord of the Rings too slow to get into, read chapter 1 so you've met the characters, and then flip forward to the Prancing Pony, and then just keep reading, because after that, things happen.
Yeah, it definitely feels like 2 halves of a book and 1 half is an extended prologue.
Yes.
It's definitely more noticeable if you read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings as a, like, foursome.
Yes.
Because
the whole first half is much more hobbity.
Yeah, the first half feels like The Hobbit, which has the sort of meandering, we're just on a little adventure tone of children's fantasy books.
We're just on a hike. There's some mild peril.
And then you grow up real fast in The Prancing Pony.
The Prancing Pony is a real watershed moment of changing the story that the Hobbits are in, which is a good effect, but we possibly could have stood to get there a little quicker. But
yeah,
I think the complaint of it being too slow can only apply to before the Prancing Pony. I think after that, everything happens so much.
Yeah, I definitely remember as a kid missing things because there was a lot happening at once.
There's a lot happening.
You have to be paying attention, especially in the second half of Fellowship and the first half of Return of the King, I feel. The 2 sections where you were just being bombarded with information at points.
Right. All the pieces are moving around the board. All of them have complex backstories. It's a lot. So I don't think it is too slow. I think parts of Fellowship are too slow. Unfortunately, that's the part you encounter first, and if you stall out reading the book and you go, I didn't finish it because it was too slow, you're not wrong. It's just there was a whole other book there you never encountered. Okay, point 3. It's got songs in it. People randomly break into song. Yeah, they do. It has songs in it, and the songs are good and fun. There is nothing I can say to persuade you on this. You either enjoy the aesthetic of putting sagas in your saga, or you don't. And I think it's great. I love the songs. I read the whole song.
It's one of those complaints that just feels like it's from people who accidentally read the wrong book.
Right.
You know?
Yeah,
it's like
fine
if you don't like sort of medieval bardic adjacent settings.
Right,
And
but that
also,
is
why
the
are you
genre we're
here?
in. I do see a lot of people saying that they skip over the songs, which I would not recommend.
I think you
Like, I
can.
recommend you
It's
skip over
absolutely
the entire
unreadable.
first half of Fellowship of the Ring apart from chapter 1. I do not recommend you skip over the songs. The songs are not an accident. They are here on purpose. They're grounding us in the kind of world this is and the kind of saga it's trying to be, and they're not long.
I think I find it kind of plausible that some people just find them hard to read, like in the sense that they're not prose, they're not like extremely literal. If
No,
you
they're
just
all
find them a
quite
bit difficult to read,
quite
that's
sort of
fine.
flowery metrical poetry.
Yeah, it's like I think there's a reason that it does so well on audiobook, which is like the audiobooks are forced to do something with them. Even if you
Right,
just read it with a rhythm like a poem, you're still forced to do something with them, which means your brain isn't hitting that sort of internal note of, oh, this is a poem now.
right. It's much easier to listen to somebody who shifts into metrical rhyme than it is to switch gears in your brain into that. I think that's possibly fair, is that, I grew up in churches singing hymns, which means, from this perspective, I grew up routinely shifting my brain into, oh, we're doing metrical poetry now.
Mm.
And performing it off an overhead projector where I had potentially never seen those words before, but I had a tune and I had the words.
Yeah.
So for my brain, we're suddenly doing metrical rhyme is like, okay, that happens. That's normal. That's part of how reading things works. I've got a lot of practice in doing that. And I can see if you haven't had practice in doing that, it could be a bit of a roadblock.
And I think especially if you're not a poetry reader and you're used to modern prose, you're already fending for your life trying to read 1937 language, or well, not
It
1937, but
no, it's true.
probably.
It is quite
Being then
poetical in
thrown
vibe.
headfirst into actual verse, I can see why that's a tipping point for some people of just like, nope, close the book, I'm done. I gave it my best shot.
Yeah. So point 3, it's got songs in it. It sure does. I love them. I don't think it's a mistake, but it sure does have songs in. What I do think I can argue on is people also like to say, well, nobody really bursts into song randomly. And to those people I say, have you never been on a long walk? It is true that in our current society in the West, we do not often randomly burst into song in the company of other people. We have a cultural thing where that's a weird thing to do.
Mm.
I guarantee, I can't name them, I'm just aware of the breadth of humanity. There will be cultures that are modern and present in the world right now where randomly bursting into song is a thing that is fine to do in public.
So, I think people just sort of forget that for most of human history, this was the most common form of entertainment.
Right, this is why I'm saying about the long walk. Most of the times people burst into song in The Lord of the Rings, they are either on a very long hike or they are sitting around a campfire in a break from their very long hike. 2 situations in which humans like to sing because we like to entertain ourselves. When you have a long period of time with nothing to occupy you and you're with friends, one of the things you can do about that is sing. I think this is normal human behavior. I think people who say, well, people don't just randomly burst into song, I think that is
Not randomly?
it's not randomly,
Like,
is
it's
the
not
thing.
like,
It's
you know,
always
Frodo's.
following a conversation about the thing. Someone goes, oh, I know a song about that. And since they are just
Yeah,
walking along
it's
with
not
nothing
like.
to do, they sing the song.
Exactly. It's not like sort of in the middle of the like intense discussion of the plot with Gandalf, Frodo's bursting into an I want song.
No.
Which would be funny, don't get me wrong, but that isn't what's happening here.
I think this is a criticism that is borrowed from people who don't like musicals.
Which
And
you're
in
allowed to not like
musicals and
musicals, but you're wrong if you think that the fact that musicals are musicals is a problem. You're allowed to
right,
not like them, but they aren't failing to be a different thing.
right, it's not actually a plot hole in the musical that it's not a plot hole in Beauty and the Beast that Belle bursts into song in the village and the villagers join in as a backing track. That's a genre convention. We're not meant to understand this to be literally happening.
Like, this isn't like Beauty and the Beast. It's, by modern musical standards, it's, Alvin and the Chipmunks or something. Like, the music makes sense in plot whether you like it or not. It's supposed to be there, and it's not, like,
Yes.
musical structured.
Yes, it's not doing the musical thing of having a musical interlude as a form of soliloquy that you are not meant to understand as literally happening. These songs are literally happening, but they're always happening in times when I think it is normal and ordinary to sing. And if in your life people do not sing in those circumstances, I think that's a fact about your life and not people.
Like, do you never sing when you're doing the washing up? Just like under your breath, quietly? People
No, I
do
sing out loud
sing.
when I'm doing the washing up.
You know what I mean, though? Like,
I
people do
serenade the
sing.
neighbours. I'm sure they're very annoyed.
I sing little love ballads to my cat all the time.
Right. Who can resist singing love ballads to the murder cat?
She does not appreciate them, but I need her to know.
So yes, I think the criticism that nobody sings like this is actually, yeah, people sing like this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, people do not really sing in the way that they do in a lot of musicals because the musical is not portraying a situation in which this is really happening. But in the way that people sing in Lord of the Rings when they are having a conversation on their very long hike and then someone knows a song about this, so they sing it. Or they happen upon, they come across the magnificent old ruins and someone knows a song about those, so as they are admiring the magnificent old ruins, they recite the song. Or
It's also
there's a couple of interludes where they're staying with elves and the elves are basically gathering around for a sing-song. Thing that
and
people do.
it's also a lot of the time the songs are not only relevant to the plot but relevant to the characters explaining or recounting the plot to one another. And functionally, it's not that different from like if you're trying to unscrew something, going, lefty loosey, righty tighty. Like, we have ways of remembering things, and one of those is enshrining them in song.
Iambic pentameter is a fantastic memory aid. I don't know why this should be on a neurological basis. I'll leave that to neurologists, but it really works. For a mnemonic to be good, it has to have the right rhythm. It's a genuine thing. Yeah, so my rebuttal to It's Got Songs in It is it sure does.
Yeah.
And that's great.
Yeah.
Point 4. It's monarchist. Yeah.
It sure is.
It is an openly backward-looking worldview where the glory days are gone forever, the elves are departing for the west, the kingdoms of men are fallen, and only the return of the true bloodline can preserve them against the darkness.
Yeah.
I don't have a defense for that except to think about what fiction is and what it's for.
Yeah.
Because The Lord of the Rings is not a political manifesto. And it's very clear that the Shire, which is an idyllic view of the English countryside, has no real governance besides custom, and that's the state of grace. In the ideal world, as portrayed within the book, you don't have a monarchy. You have, like, maybe a mayor, but he only has to get involved when people are being really unreasonable.
So it's instructive to think about how, obviously, much writing has been done about how Lord of the Rings reflects Tolkien's experiences in the war.
Yeah.
In that, sort of, it's innocent young people who go away to war and are fundamentally changed by that. And a lot of it is very much a lengthy allegorical understanding of trauma, despite the fact that Tolkien was deeply anti-allegory just on the face of it.
Yeah.
It's very easy to read it as a process through which someone came to understand their own existence as a different person to the one who went away. It's a very clumsy way of describing it. But I think in that light, it feels very different to be hearkening back to a former time when everything was right.
Right, when you've just had World Wars 1 and 2, the time before that really does take on a glowing comparison.
Like, yeah, I would love to live in a time before everyone died.
Exactly.
I would not be that fussed
week.
about who was in charge.
It's like, even with COVID, we talk about the before times.
Yeah. In the same way that we're now living in the world that COVID made, J.R.R. Tolkien was in a world that mass slaughter had made.
Yeah.
And when you're looking to a time before that, I don't think anyone is that fussed about who was running it. It's just there was a before time when things were okay, and anything to get back to that would be a good thing. But also, it's not possible. It can't be done.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much the before times were monarchist, and we're trying to get back to the before times. And the monarchy's sort of beside the point.
Yeah. Monarchy is there to be a representative of the existence of a nation, which is in and of itself a very sort of common idea in both ancient literature and in modern fantasy. The idea that the king or queen, the monarch, is this kind of natural emblem of the land rather than an actual state figure.
Arthur will return at our time of greatest need.
Yeah, so, Aragorn isn't an individual political actor. Aragorn is a literal embodiment of the land as it should be.
Yeah.
I don't have to love that that's a very monarchist way of doing that to understand that that's what it's trying to say, rather than everything would be great if the king was in charge of it all.
Yeah, no, I think it is about that harkening back, and I think that's also why, along with the monarchy, we get this real predominance of a bloodline-based system of importance in this book. So important characters are routinely introduced by the names of their fathers.
Yeah.
And Tolkien actually uses that in multiple cases to demonstrate that a character is being given importance.
Yeah.
So when Frodo's introduced in Rivendell to the council, he is introduced as Frodo, son of Drogo, which is cueing the rest of the council that he is a person of significance whose bloodline is known, even though none of them has ever heard of Drogo, and Drogo, in fact, never did anything of note. We don't know anything about him.
It's also very funny because all of these people know Bilbo.
They all know Bilbo, but Bilbo is his uncle, so he's introduced as Frodo, son of Drogo, a person about whom nothing is known. He's just a name. Even the reader knows nothing about him. He was probably perfectly nice and a bit eccentric, and he died young. The end. But he's named when Frodo is named, because the aesthetic is one of that historical depth. It's about deep time. It's the same reason we meet multiple characters who remember the world of long ago when things were otherwise, and why so many of the songs are bits of ancient sagas. And we're restoring the ancient line of the kings of Gondor for the same reason we are singing about the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin. None of which is explained in this book. Like, you can go to the Silmarillion and get it, but it's not here. All you get in this book is a line from a song that the world was fair in Durin's day. It's that, in the before times, when things were better, this is how it was. And we're trying to restore the before times, but with an acknowledgement that we cannot restore the before times. The bad things will always have happened. The elves will still depart for the west. But at least it'll be better than it is.
That can be true, whilst still acknowledging that out of universe, of course he was a monarchist. It was the late 30s, early 40s, and he was a posh Englishman.
He was an Oxford Don in the 1930s to 50s. Of course he was a monarchist. It had never crossed his mind not to be.
He probably met like 3 people in his entire life who weren't monarchists, and he didn't have long conversations with any of them.
Right, this is the same sort of complaint as why is Narnia about being kings and queens? Because they were that kind of people. And they had that kind of worldview.
That's not a defense. It's the opposite of a defense. It's kind of a condemnation. But it's also worth saying that, like, in universe, this makes sense. But the reason it makes sense in universe is because it was just completely natural and unquestionable in the mind of the author of the universe.
And I do think it's very telling that the ideal society is the Shire, where the king is an ancient and distant memory with absolutely no relevance to your life. But of course, you would pay lip service to the idea of, yeah, of course, the king, great.
Yeah, because that was
long live the king, and then you would get on with your life. Ideal state, which is also what it is like to live in England at times of non-crisis.
Yeah, especially if you were a rich dude living in the home counties.
Right. The order of the universe descends from there being a king, but also the king is not important to your day-to-day in any way.
King is also over there, not over here bothering us.
He's somewhere else, doing whatever it is kings do to keep the sun rising.
It's actually, like, kind of a huge deal within the context of, like, our particular constitutional monarchy that the king and or queen is supposed to do as little as possible. That's why it's a scandal when we find out they've been doing things. Every, like, 10 years we discover this for the first time. We
rehab the scandal of, these extremely powerful people with institutionalized lobbying powers are lobbying.
It's a shock.
For their own benefits. Every time we're like, they can't do that. They're the queen.
They're not supposed to be actually doing anything. They're supposed to just sit on a throne in a shiny hat.
You are of symbolic and ritual importance. You're not supposed to actually evade taxes.
Like, yeah, I don't think it's surprising that J.R.R. Tolkien is a monarchist. I also don't think it's a takedown of J.R.R. Tolkien. It might have been if he'd written this in 1996, you know?
And that, I think, is the redemptive spin on this, is that, yeah, Tolkien was writing when he was writing. People are writing fantasy books in the 2020s that are more explicitly, monarchy is great and we should restore it. What's their excuse?
Yeah.
I think there's a degree of using the Lord of the Rings as a scapegoat to say, well, this is why fantasy is monarchist. And I think people are writing their books on purpose, and they should be asked why they're writing monarchies. If that's the question you want to ask, we should not be blaming this book from 70 years ago for that.
I think we can absolutely blame and hold J.R.R. Tolkien to account for the writing he produced.
Right, but not for the entire genre that descends from this poetic model.
The final series of Game of Thrones was not J.R.R. Tolkien's fault.
Other people were to blame for that. So I'm not saying it's not monarchist, but I'm saying we should only blame it for the monarchy that is in it. And that sometimes the monarchy is in it not because he was making a political point that monarchy is great, but because he just wasn't making a political point, and the political neutral for him was a monarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's writing from a perspective where to have a republic is a radical approach, to have a tyranny is a radical approach, to have a king in somewhere over there who doesn't bother you is the neutral
also,
thing.
Let's be honest, it is set in mystical, barely disguised England. We got the Roman.
Right, he's doing it for Arthur.
We've got the home country.
We have to acknowledge Aragorn is Arthur.
It's not even Arthuriana. It's the other subset of it's the non-Arthuriana stuff that nobody cares about. To a very strong extent. It's the other lost reclaimed kings from medieval literature that nobody cares about because Arthur has the shiniest hat.
I'm not a medievalist. I've never read the books about those kings.
Yeah, no one has. But my point is, it would have been such a bold political stance to not be monarchist in a book that is functionally about fantasy England. To be the good fantasy version of England would be the one without the king, please don't behead me.
Right, I'm hearkening back explicitly to Anglo-Saxons with their long knives and Norsemen, and I'm saying, do you know what was really the best and coolest thing about them? It was that they were Republicans.
That would not fly.
Although, please write that.
I would love that. That would be great.
It would be a great book. I don't think you could have published it when Tolkien published this.
I promise this isn't treason. It's actually about hobbitses.
Right. And also,
I want that version of Lord of the Rings.
It would be great. Also on the subject of only blaming the Lord of the Rings for what's in the Lord of the Rings and not what anyone else has done since. Point 5. Orcs are always evil.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is a heavy one, kids.
Yeah. They are. I don't think we're meant to read this. I'm doing a lot of authorial intention stuff today, but I think authorial intent is something you can choose to consider in the same way you can choose to treat the text as if it fell from the sky. I don't think we're meant to read this as a genetics type of thing. I think Tolkien's worldview is one where you could have a good orc, but it wouldn't be one orc who happened to be born good. It would be an orc who had been exposed over years to other ways of being. It would be an orc who'd been removed from the orc cycles of violence and had learned gentleness and chosen to switch sides and exist in grief and regret and therefore also in hope instead of going back to being an orc.
The thing is, I personally have always, well, not always, I read these books when I was 7. I had less complicated thoughts when I read The Hobbit.
Yeah.
As an adult, read the orcs as very clearly represent the horror and dehumanization of war in how it makes you view the other side.
Yes.
It's always seemed very obvious to me that that's what the orcs are.
And very much orcs in this setting are not a natural kind of being. Then orcs were made. The orcs were made specifically through abuse and control until they became a self-reinforcing abusive loop. Exactly. So they're always evil because orc is a culture imposed from above by people who decided to make them evil. So if you were a baby orc raised by hobbits, you wouldn't be an orc. You would be some other kind of person than an orc, because an orc is an enculturated thing.
So this is a period of war, so the 2 world wars, where the broad consensus on the British armies was the sort of lions led by asses approach, especially World War I, but it did continue into World War II, where there was a sort of understanding that British foot soldiers were these amazing heroic do-gooders, and the British generals and upper tiers were functionally clowns in World War I, and then sort of young people out of their depth in World War II.
Yeah. And as you say, it is very much a dehumanization of the opposing side soldiers, where if you stop and think about how Hans over there is just a kid who wants to go back to his girlfriend and maybe go to university and have just an ordinary life. If you think about that, you're not going to be able to drop shells on him.
Culpability in the view of especially Brits, but I think a lot of people post World War I and II, there was this sense that the lower classes, the working class, were very much not truly culpable for their behaviour. And this is something that was addressed kind of in the Nuremberg trials. This was something that was a defining element of philosophy and law for the next 30 years, was what is the culpability of the low ranks? And to what degree do we recognise their humanity and helplessness? This is a question people were wrestling with for like the next 50 years and are still wrestling with today.
Yeah, and there is that line that people like to sort of throw out as an argument ender of just following orders not being a defense. Actually, for a lot of people, for a lot of things done in both those wars, absolutely that was a defense, both legally and emotionally. I did that because I was ordered to do that, and if I had not followed orders, I would have been shot.
And I mean this more from the perspective of the people fighting those people who say they're just following orders. Like, it would have been 100% a matter of you can't recognise the people opposite you holding guns as people, because then war doesn't work. And then that is something that people had to go home and reconcile within themselves, that they killed people. And
right.
Yeah, it makes perfect
what you did because
experience. It makes perfect sense for somebody experiencing that to go home and think about what kind of monsters are enemies as a vague concept. If you just have an idea in your head of the enemy, what is that? What are you picturing? What does that mean? And what actually is it?
Yeah. And what's going on there's a sequence in The Two Towers where Merry and Pippin are captured by orcs, and they are transported by the orcs for several days before they escape. Well, before they escape and the orcs get slaughtered, every single one. Which, to be fair, we are also meant to understand as, oh, that's a lot. We meet the riders of Rohan coming away from having killed every single orc they met. And we are supposed to react to that with, oh, that's heavy. That's a lot. That's a big thing that just happened. That these possibly good guys just killed every single one of them. That's okay. It's meant to sort of pull you up short a bit. But a part of the point of that sequence, I think, is because we didn't need to have it. We could have, from a writing perspective, just had the other three following them and meeting up with them in the forest. But we have scenes from their point of view in amongst the orcs, so we can see how the orcs are all driving each other, because if any of them rebels against any of this, they do immediately get murdered.
Yeah.
So we are shown how constrained the choices are for an orc, because it is either be an orc or be dead. There isn't a third choice. They don't have an option of just throw down their swords and don't be an orc, because then they get killed by all the orcs. It's you can't just stop being an orc when you're surrounded by orcs, because then you're surrounded by orcs and you're not on their side, and that's a bad place to be.
Yeah.
And I think, it's being in the army is bad. So yes, orcs are always evil, but I think that, as you say, it's armies are always breeding grounds for this. And when you are ordered into evil with sufficient threat, it becomes very difficult to distinguish you as an individual from the things that you are doing under threat.
This can all be true, and it can also be true that the racialization of the orcs is a problem.
Yes, I am much more sympathetic to, like, orcs are always evil, I think, is a deliberate, opposing armies of people who have been enculturated to do evil are evil. The bad guy is evil, I think is what you're saying there, but the orcs are also described as darker skinned and also consistently working with dark skinned southern people from exotic southern lands where people have dark skin, but they also are swarthy and untrustworthy and inherently in their exoticism inherently unwholesome. And I can't redeem that one.
excruciatingly specific in facial features at points.
I cannot defend the armies of Sauron are allying with Arabs.
And it's
can't. That's what's in
indefensible.
there, and I can't defend it. It's indefensible.
I think, like, yes, there's an argument to be made that, like, there's an argument to be made in terms of how specifically you interpret this, but I don't think there's a good interpretation. There are degrees of bad.
I think the spectrum goes from deliberately awful to lazily awful.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's a good answer.
No, and I'm
not going to defend that point.
I don't want there to be a, like, haha, you thought this was racist, but actually, gotcha, because that's one of the worst things in reviewing.
No, the racialization of the orcs is racist. It is.
It just is.
And if we want to if we want to feel good about J.R.R. Tolkien and his work, we can say it was racist because he was being lazy. But that's the best we can say.
This is the thing, is like we said earlier that Lord of the Rings is fair for its day. This is one of the least fair for its day parts.
And
admittedly, its day was bad, but
right. But again, I don't think orcs being evil is a problem. I don't think that's something an editor should have fixed. I do think the racialization could have been fixed in editing.
It just should have been orcs from all species. Just take
Honestly,
it out.
It would have been I think it would have been a stronger theme of what is an orc. It's a person who has been coerced and abused into a cycle of abuse on the other side.
And this is definitely, I know we're going to mention, like, quite frequently that this has suffered from subsequent authors. This is one of the areas where I think subsequent authors were not only, like, obviously all of them were right to write whatever they wanted, but this is one of the ones where I most go, like, yeah, after this, have a palate cleanser, go read Unseen Academicals, go read Captive of the Orcs, like, just refresh yourself after doing too much reading of the passages about how the orcs look.
Unseen Academicals is, I think, a very direct answer to this kind of thing. I think it's addressing exactly that idea of orc is a culture in which you are coerced to exist.
Yeah, a lot of people have done much, much better orcs. Some of them just by going like, nope, and some of them by directly answering Tolkien. And both of them have done really, really well.
Yeah.
And then some of them are the Urgles in Inheritance Cycle.
So it's hard. So drawing a line under that one because we cannot fully redeem that point. Point 6. This is going to be a very brief one. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Point 6. There aren't any women. To which my response is, and therefore you can't be weird about them. I would rather read The Lord of the Rings where there's like 3 women ever and they're all beautiful and brilliant and one of them is a warrior queen. I would rather read that than a work of fantasy in which there's tons of women and they are all heavily sexualized, and I would rather read a book where the women are absent than a book where the women are tits.
Yeah.
And the one thing we can say about The Lord of the Rings is that the women are not here for sex appeal. Because they're not here.
There is no sex appeal in this book.
There is no sex appeal in this entire book. Even when we are told that Arwen is the most beautiful thing on the earth, we're just like, that's what we get told. Like she was dazzlingly beautiful, and it was like the sun shone out of her.
Yeah,
what does she look like? Unclear, unspecified.
Women in Lord of the Rings are beautiful the way that, like, waterfalls and semi-precious stones are beautiful.
Right.
Like, just in this abstract, gleaming way that you don't really want to do anything about.
Right. Nobody is enticed. Nobody is provoked to have feelings of a carnal nature towards anyone at any point in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Like, obviously, this is one of those ones where it's in the fair for its day camp for me, because, like, on the one hand, it's not like I'd be turning it down if you gave me Lord of the Rings, but half the hobbits are women, and, like, Gandalf is a woman, or whatever. Like,
but obviously, it would have to be the same book where they were women.
But that's not what we would have gotten.
Right, exactly. I do want Merry and Pippin idiot buddies, but they're fail girls.
I would love that. That would be great.
It was not... That is not an alternate universe that Tolkien could have written.
No. And, like, when I try to think about contemporary authors writing women, I do think, like, yeah, we got off okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, there aren't any women, but at least he's not weird about the women that aren't there. That's all I have to say. Okay, point 7, deeply silly. But I have seen this so many times. Point 7, the Eagles should have solved by just flying the ring to the cracks of doom. As we are fond of saying, bestie, that's not a plot hole, that's the plot.
Literally, that's the plot.
I'm not even interested in why the Eagles could or could not do this thing. I am happy with the Eagles didn't want to as an explanation if we have to have one.
It's not their job, you know?
I'm happy with one does not simply fly into Mordor. I don't need a logically unimpeachable explanation for why no other story was possible. This is the story we're telling.
I also feel like this complaint has come to me from many people who complain that the book is too wordy, and it's just like, so you wanted them to spend an entire page explaining why the Eagles couldn't fly them to Mordor?
Right, it's too long already, and you want them to explain why we're not in a different story that's short and simple and clever loopholes, remove all the peril and the hardship, and the quest is over by tea time.
To me, that's compelling an argument that the Eagles should have done that. Like, that does not sound like a safe way to transport the most important item in the universe.
Right. But also, the Eagles don't... As I say, I don't need an in-universe explanation for why this can't happen. The Eagles don't take the ring to Mordor because this is not a story about the Eagles taking the ring to Mordor. It's a story about Frodo taking the ring to Mordor.
I would read a story about the Eagles taking the ring to Mordor, though.
Right, but that's not. But it's an epic saga. Why didn't Loki simply let go of the stick and not be kidnapped by an eagle? Because stories are not logical constructions of good decisions. Frodo takes the ring. That's the plot. That's the story. Be gone with your logical. Why not simply treat this as a logic puzzle?
It falls
That's not the story we're telling.
It falls into what I call like the Scream situation, where in the film Scream, there's a bit where the main character says like, "Oh, I don't like horror movies because the main character at the front door," and then like 10 minutes later on screen, she gets attacked by a serial killer in her house. And she tries to go for the front door, but in like panic, she can't get the latch open, so she runs upstairs because it's the only way to go. It's just very immediate, like, yeah, perfect world, you would make all the right choices, but in a moment, you really don't.
Right.
It's really stupid to act like characters in books should always make what you as an outside observer believe to be the most logical possible decision.
Right.
You don't have all the information, you don't know how long the Eagles can carry weight or whatever, but also, they're under a lot of stress right now.
There's no Eagles at the council volunteering.
Yeah.
But also, as I say, I don't have a lot of patience with taking this external view, why not solve the logic puzzle this way?
It's not a puzzle to solve, it's a story.
And in the story that we're telling, this is what happens, and this is the kind of story it is. It's the kind of story where you hike the length of a continent carrying what could be the salvation or the doom of everything in the world around your neck, and it gets heavier, and the temptation gets worse every time. That's the story we're telling. And you can't tell that story if, we solved it in 2 days because we got someone to fly the thing to the destination like this was just a logic puzzle. And if the answer we have to have for why not do it the easy way was, the characters never thought of it, I'm okay with that. Because stories are not logic puzzles.
Maybe that version exists out there somewhere in the multiverse, so to speak. But this version we're reading is the version where the story happened.
So I just don't have a lot of time for this logic puzzle approach. It's not a plot hole, it's the plot.
If you like stories where everybody behaves completely rationally like they're in a logic puzzle, this is just not a story for you.
I struggle to think of stories that are.
Mystery novels? Not all of them.
But... Actually, that is fair, because I recently watched, because I was in a hotel room, I recently watched the Agatha Christie where they're on the little island.
Oh, the Caribbean Mystery or the other one?
No, the other one.
Oh, which one's the other one?
Oh, Evil Under the Sun.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which absolutely is a logic puzzle, by which I mean it is impossible, it is implausible, it is incomprehensible that the perpetrators of the murder could have come up with that plan starting from the beginning and working forwards. It is a plan that only works backwards. It's not a plan you could come up with. It is only an explanation that you can create from the puzzle pieces. But if you think about it as a story, these characters could not have come up with that because so much of it depends on like integrating their plan with tiny decisions that other people make on the day.
Yeah, well, I mean, Agatha Christie not necessarily invented, but definitely formalized and popularized the true fair play murder mystery. And one of the real hallmarks of the fair play murder mystery is it doesn't actually have to make sense as long as it is fair.
You have all the puzzle pieces, so does Poirot. He puts them together. You either do or don't. The result is
it's more of a game than a
chronologically
book.
coherent set of events, but chronologically coherent in the same way as the contraption from the Mousetrap games is. Like you didn't build that because it made sense. You built it because if you put the pieces together in this way, technically speaking, the impulse travels the length of the machine and results in the murder.
It's, like I said, it's more of a game than a story.
Yes.
It can be a very well-written game, but it's a game.
Yes. So there's your other end of the spectrum. If this story was a Poirot murder mystery, then I would accept the argument that, the Eagles should have done it. But it's an epic saga where they don't. So...
to do it so much, go write the version where the Eagles did it. I'll probably read it.
Right, honestly do, because, okay, you've taken up a chapter or so with the Eagles did it, and then what? And then what's the story that you need to tell? What's the world look like? What's the emotional impact? Where's the story? Genuinely, not as a gotcha. Persuade me there's a story if the Eagles solve it. What happens next? Why does it matter that the Eagles solved it? What's the personal and emotional fallout of that? Because that's where stories are.
The Eagles are now the saviors of Middle-earth. What do they do with that?
Right. Are we going to crown an eagle? What happens with Saruman?
Does an eagle kill him? Because I want that. Disemboweled.
I mean, that would
by
be
an
great,
eagle.
but there are so many dominoes that only fall because we are pursuing a very particular... Saruman's downfall only happens because there is time for that to happen. If you have just knocked Sauron over in 2 days, what are we doing with Saruman? Tell me the story.
Armies and other actors.
Right, who are either not on the move or in other places.
They can't all get carried away by eagles.
Does Helm's Deep still happen?
Does this now become a millennia-long war because the biggest element of it got taken out too early and people are still left here not sure if they're supposed to be fighting?
Right, does Saruman get to be, in fact, the Wizard King of the world? Because now there's no one bigger than him. Tell me the story.
I'd read it.
Point 8, our last and final point. It's derivative. I genuinely have seen this complaint. I genuinely have. And in some ways it's very cute because it is literally the opposite of that. It has been derived from so much that now you read it and you're like, oh, I've seen this before.
Yeah. And also, on the flip side, it is derivative, and it's derivative of stuff that nobody has read.
Right. I realise if I was reading this as a medievalist, I would read it and go, oh, I recognise the saga he stole that from. But I haven't read those sagas, so I don't.
It's also, let's be honest, we simply have accepted as a society that retelling ancient stories doesn't count.
Right, which is a mistake. It's incorrect.
Like, you can agree or disagree with that, but we have sort of just accepted that as a publishing ecosystem. Right, we
decided that originality is a requirement.
You're allowed to say that Percy Jackson is derivative of, I don't know, Harry Potter. You're not allowed to say it's derivative of Greek mythology. This is stupid,
sorry, yes,
but it is what we've agreed to do.
Sorry, no, I follow. Yes, that is absolutely something we've decided, that is that you can derive from ancient legends as much as you like. It's not cheating to retell Beowulf. It's cheating to retell Star Wars, even though Star Wars is retelling the monomyth.
And also Star Wars is retelling a lot of films that were actually contemporary, they were just in Japanese.
But that doesn't count if you're retelling foreign media. That doesn't count as well.
It
basically only counts if you retell contemporary stuff that your audience is familiar with.
I think the thing is, it's derivative if A, we can tell, and B, you didn't have to try. I think that's stupid, but I do think that is kind of the consensus.
I think it is, but that does not really impact on the fact that the Lord of the Rings, according to those terms, what it's deriving is sufficiently ancient that it doesn't count. And the reason it feels familiar is that it's been repeatedly imitated. Although, it's interesting what people copy. Right?
Yeah.
Most of the derivative stuff is only superficial in its imitation. The elves are woodsy hippies, and the dwarves are grouchy miners, and the orcs are there for you to kill, and the humans are regular, and the halflings like food.
Yeah.
We don't get so much deriving from, like, hobbits are so hidebound and tradition focused, they will publicly shun you for riding in a boat.
I think that nobody ever steals the funniest bit of the hobbits to me, which is that their main trope is sneakiness, and they simply do not use it because that would be rude.
Right.
That's
Their actual
amazing!
culture, their physical trait is they're actually really good at sneaking around. Their cultural trait is they are so heavily traditionalist that it is very dodgy of you to have ever crossed the river, and they will publicly shun you for knowing how to row a boat.
Incredible retelling
People
of
don't,
fairy folklore. I love
people don't
this.
copy that bit.
It's the best thing. No one does, but it's so good.
People don't copy that bit. They copy the superficials, and they are trying to recatch the lightning because this is the book that defined a genre. And the genre is that of an epic quest to destroy the evil, slay the dragon, and have armies clashing in the background of your heroic duel.
A huge portion of subsequent fantasy literature had to sort of, just on an emotional, instinctual level, had to choose between A, retelling Lord of the Rings, B, pulling out a thread of Lord of the Rings and focusing on that, or C, picking a fight with Lord of the Rings.
And most of that imitation hasn't resulted in, like, because it's an aesthetic imitation, not a thematic one. Like, most of that genre doesn't have the great armies clashing. Like, it has the armies clashing in the background of heroic duel. Lord of the Rings has the great armies clashing as a way of distracting the enemy from a soft middle-aged village squire and his gardener who are having the world's worst hiking trip. There is
Yeah.
no actual... They are not armies clashing while the hero ascends the tower to fight the Dark Lord. It's armies clashing while Mr. Smith from the big house and his gardener climb a hill.
I know I've been like repeatedly dunking on A Song of Ice and Fire in this one. I want to stress I love it. I dislike quite a lot of the cultural sort of response to it that we've had. One of the things that made me like a little bit dubious when I first saw Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire taking off in the public consciousness was a lot of people were like, oh, this is like proper fantasy because it thinks about logistics and travel times. And I'm like, 90% of Lord of the Rings is hiking.
It genuinely, it's a
It's
book
a
about
very
hiking.
hiking heavy experience to read.
I have this theory, which is I think if you could somehow extract Lord of the Rings from its actual place in the history of the genre, and you could bring it out new, and so if you published Lord of the Rings into the genre in its extruded fantasy product form, I think all the big images would be familiar, and then I think the actual plot would be quite fun and quite pointed as an answer to the idea that your dragon slayer and your quest completer and your lost heir to the throne would be the same person. Because
Oh,
it splits them up. It's like, no, the dragon slaying happened 20 years ago by someone else. The quest is going to be completed by this soft middle-aged guy on a hike and his gardener. And the lost heir to the throne is this other guy. These are not the same guy. They come together by accident. You need all of them to do the thing, but also what the thing really requires is a dedication to really bad hiking trips. Just the world's worst hike.
If you could somehow bring out Lord of the Rings now without anybody noticing, people would say it was a brilliantly witty response to the problems with Lord of the Rings.
Right, they'd be like, and then this little guy just goes on a hike, and it turns out that having a really bad time for a long time is what it takes. And all of this stuff with armies and the fate of worlds is sort of a distraction from doing the job that is in front of you. And it's like, yep, but that was the story he was telling in the first place. You just missed it.
Yeah. It's one of those ones that, on the one hand, we have mentioned there are parts of it which I completely understand put some people off, even if they don't put me off.
Sure.
There are also parts of it which are flat out indefensible.
Yeah.
However, it has truly suffered more than I think any other work has suffered from the follow the leader syndrome within a genre it created.
Yeah. So just to put a little bow on this, so what's difficult about this whole sort of form of analysis is not arguing that The Lord of the Rings is good. It's very easy to argue that The Lord of the Rings is good. Many people have done so. What's hard is arguing that it is secretly good in a way that transcends its superficial badness. I think The Lord of the Rings is superficially good. It's an enjoyable book to read with a great many atmospheric scenes and memorable images, and that's the level on which it is most often imitated. So there's the structure of the long quest to an evil place, encountering dangers along the way. The Mines of Moria, this magnificent, sprawling, pitch-black ruin beneath the mountain full of ghosts and goblins, that gets copied. The elves in their forests who've been left behind by a fast-moving world, that defines what an elf is. These things are copied and reiterated constantly. I think the impression of a deeper badness comes most often from thinking that The Lord of the Rings, having initiated or at least popularized these tropes, is nothing more than its imitators. And I think that's where we can redeem it. That's the secretly good part. This is a story about epic quests, but secretly it's a story about being too small and scared for your quest and doing it because someone must.
Yeah.
It's a story about choosing to go on into the dark despite every offer to turn aside and sleep safely and give up the burden of doing the right thing.
That.
The moral of The Lord of the Rings is that small hands do these things because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere. And I think that's the secretly good part in the middle, underneath all of the imitation.
Oh, sorry, cat wants door opened. No, don't make noises. Okay. That was slightly anticlimactic to your big.
I think that's a very cat-like behaviour.
She has great timing. Okay, shall we roll some dice?
Let's roll some dice. Let's find out what we're inflicting on you. We are getting to the point, dear listener, where we are going to have to, through sheer lack of things to roll, produce our season finale and refill our hats.
I know, I'm very excited. We're down to 6 for schools of analysis.
6? That's so not very many.
Okay, generate 3. That's a moral parable. Okay.
Ooh, this could be interesting.
Yeah, I can redeem myself from religious readings. And then 101. 60. Let me just find it. Elementary! Oh, that's going to be so fun.
Ooh, this could be interesting. Yes.
This is going to be fun.
Elementary as a moral parable.
Oh, I've genuinely already written this in my head. Okay.
Excellent. Send me whatever episodes are most relevant to your reading.
Oh, have you seen... I'm aware you're familiar with it.
I have seen GIFs.
Okay, cool. I will send you some stuff to read. I'm really excited.
This should be fun.
Okay, goodbye,
right.
listener.
Thank you for your attention. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Analysis Roulette, a podcast applying a randomly selected mode of analysis to a randomly selected creative work, just to see what happens. Your hosts have been Dia and Duck. You can find us on Spotify or on YouTube, and if you'd like to get in touch, you can send us an email at analysisroulette@gmail.com. And remember, if you like our show, share it with your friends, and if you don't like our show, share it with your enemies. Thanks.